My name is Shirley Beck, and I'm interviewing my cousin Wyatt Trainer, who had a birthday last week on August the 20th. He's 93 years old, and he grew up in Blanco, and he is going to be telling us about growing up in Blanco and what Blanco looked like and what people were doing when he was a young man growing up in Blanco. And he's full of stories about his life in Blanco and what people that he knew and loved were doing. And tell us again where you were born, Wyatt.
I was born about 2 or 3 miles down the Blanco River from town, across Highway 165, I believe it is, just opposite the cage hole, we called it in those days. That's where we went to go swimming. And I was there a few years, and then we were sharecroppers or renters of farms, and we moved to about 6 or 7 farms during our time farming, and that was the first one. After that, we moved down up the river to 2 or 3 places up around my grandfather's ranch and farm, and we lived in those places for short times. And then the last house we lived in outside of Blanco city limits was, we called it, I think, the old Durham place, but it's the house, the 2-story white house that sits up old 281,
yes,
going south,
Loop 163,
just away from the cemetery there. And we lived in that house for quite some time. That was our last farmhouse, but the farm was all back in there, where now there nothing but houses. And we had, I think it was between 60 and 100 acres of land, and obviously there were no houses on it. But our cotton field abutted the cemetery.
So you grew cotton? Your father grew cotton?
Yes. That pretty much, I think, tells who I am and where we live.
And so you went to school in Blanco?
The first school I attended was a 1-room school on Miller Creek, and I was there in the first grade for about a half year. And then the second half of the year, we had moved to a farm upriver from Blanco, and I finished out the first grade there, and I finished the second grade there.
That was at McKinney.
At McKinney. And then about the middle of the third grade, we moved into town. And when we did, we lived on, we called it Dog Walk Street at that time. That was sort of a derogatory term for the little street we lived on, which is Elm Street now. And at that time, our house and the officer's house were the only two on the west side of Elm Street until you got further down. But we lived next door to each other, and Leroy Alfers and I were boyhood friends, and we prowled the town, we prowled the country, and a lot of my stories deal with him and me together doing things. And Elm Street, as of now, there was a cotton gin there. There was a mill there that ground corn and wheat and other things. They ground a number of things. And during the Depression years, when people had no money, I know my grandfather planted a small acre or so of sugar cane, for example, and I helped trim the sugar cane down to where it was stalks. We took it to the molasses mill, which was somewhere near where the Dairy Queen now is. And we made molasses. I drove the mule from time to time that went around and around in circles and pressed the cane and squeezed the juice out. And the juice was then transported, maybe 30, 40 feet away to the cookers. And the juice was cooked in 3 different copper pans, big copper pans. And one moved to the other, and 2 or 3 men were there skimming the foam off of it. And when it got to the last cooker, it was done. Then the farmers who had brought in the sugar cane, who had no money to pay for the work, they gave a portion of the production to the owner of the sugar mill as payment. I think about 1/3 of the gallon cans that were filled, and then the owner took the balance and went home. Then they, instead of going into town and buying sugar, a lot of them, including my grandfather and grandmother, would use the molasses as their sugar for their coffee and a few other things to save money. And as a result of what they raised on their farm and what they had ground at the mill and produced at the molasses mill, they had all of the food that anyone would want, and went through the Depression okay.
Can you go through your list here of things that
All right. Now, I want to tell a few stories about things that happened in Blanco, not about the looks of Blanco, but things that happened there. And I'm going to start out with the shootout down on the corner of the square. It took place, Bonnie and Clyde were reported to be coming from toward Johnson City, and they were going to hit Blanco. So the Texas Rangers came to Blanco, and they set up a trap there on the entrance to the square going south on 281. And they invited my Uncle Adley Byers to join them. That was, I think, a gesture on the part of the Rangers. But he was the town marshal at that time, and he would prowl around town at night with his big old 45 hanging on his belt. And I don't think he ever shot at anybody until this occurred. And he and the 2 Rangers opened fire, and at that time we lived only a couple of blocks away on Pecan Street in a relatively new house, which I'll tell you about later. But at any rate, Bonnie and Clyde made a U-turn and took out back toward Johnson City or Austin, wherever they went, and totally escaped, unscathed, I think. The next day, a cousin of mine, Ralph Wyatt, and I went up and down the wooden pale fence all along 281 for about 2 or 3 blocks up the street, and we took our pocket knives and dug bullets out of the fence, and we came to the Brigham house. That was Percy Brigham, who was vice president of the Blanco National Bank at that time. And Percy's wife, I don't remember her first name, but she was reading a book near the window that faced out on 281. And one of the bullets went into that window and went right by her face and into the wall of her house. She wasn't touched and wasn't hurt, but it was a miracle that she wasn't. Anyway, as I say, Ralph Wyatt and I dug bullets out all up and down the street, and being boys, we didn't think anything of them. We played with them a little while and threw them away. They would probably be worth something today. But that was the Bonnie and Clyde story, and they lived to rob a bunch of banks after that. So it was the trap was a failure.
I'm sure that Mr. Byers probably told that story the rest of his life, though, don't you think?
Well, that was his claim to fame and glory.
Claim to fame.
That was Retta Jane's
Yes,
grandfather.
Right.
And I told her that story one time, and she didn't remember anything about it, about her dad. I mean, about her grandfather being involved.
The Remax real estate business is in the Brigham House now, so that two-story house on 281. Mm-hmm.
The next story I have has to do with weather. We all know we're in a drought now, and when I believe I'm almost positive we were living in this old Durham place near the cemetery when this took place. We had a week of terrifically cold weather, down in the teens, low teens, and after that was over with, the weekend came along, and the ice had frozen over below the 281 old road bridge, and
that's the Loop 163.
It was 4 or 5 inches deep when it was all over with. So a bunch of the town boys got in their Model Ts that they, at that time, they could buy them for $10 to $25 a piece, running cars, because the Model A's had come in and taken their place, and people didn't want those Model Ts anymore. So anyway, about 6 or 8 of those boys drove down on that ice with their cars and got out on it, and they'd speed up, and then they'd turn the wheel of turn the steering wheel, and the car would go around and around and around and around down the river. And the dam down there had made it a little tiny lake, and was the only dam at that time on the Blanco River in this part of the Blanco River.
That was before the state park was put in.
That's true. That was before, and we can talk about the state park a little later on,
right.
But then another event that occurred in Blanco, I'm not totally accurate about the date that this took place, but there is a record of it here somewhere. The western side of the square caught fire and was almost totally destroyed. And at that time I was living down what is now Elm Street, and was rather close to the square, and I heard all the commotion down there, and I jumped in my shoes or clothes and took off and went down to see what was going on. It was real early in the morning, and the fire was raging, and it had just started good down toward the south end of the street, and there was a little store down there that was owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Frank Moore, I'm pretty sure their name was. They lived in the upper half, and they had the little store downstairs. But at any rate, by the time I got there, their store was just about gone, and the wind was blowing from the south, unfortunately, and the fire just kept going. The fire trucks started arriving from all over the area, and I stood over by the courthouse fence for 2 or 3 hours watching all this happen. So I was an eyewitness to it. When it was all over with, as I remember it, the only thing still standing was the Cage brothers, or Jack Cage's store. He had clothing and groceries and all of these kind of things. His store wasn't touched, and 1 or 2 buildings next to that I think survived, but everything further south totally destroyed. All that was left was just the shells of the buildings. And it was later on rebuilt, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell a story that I call the crow story. Someone had taken a baby crow that had fallen out of the nest or whatever, and they had kept it as a pet, and it had learned to talk. And it hung out on the square over in one of those hackberry trees that at that time grew along the courthouse. And it would stay up there, and it would fly across the street over above the stores on the north side of the square. And it'd sit up there, and it'd do a certain amount of talking. But at that time, Mr. Charlie Crist, who was our banker, owner, and operator, owned, I think, every building on that side of the square, and he had retained 3 locations for his businesses. One was the bank, one was a lumber yard on the corner of the highway, and the other one was a feed house further down to the east. And he had a black man from Peyton Colony working in the feed house. His name was Jack, and I think his last name may have been Coffee, but I'm not totally sure of that. But at least he worked there. He was an elderly gentleman. And Mrs. Crist, who lived in the Crist house down at the end of all these buildings, at the east end, she would get out in her yard. She used Jack for odd jobs, and she'd get out in her yard and she'd say, "Jack, Jack," and Jack would hear her, and he would trundle up down, "Yes, Miss Crist, what do you need?" And she'd tell him the flower bed needed cleaning or whatever, and he would do it. And
let me interrupt you. That's where the Crist house is, where the post office is now.
Yes,
Yes,
yes, it was. And this crow got in the habit. He had learned how to say Jack just as she did. So he'd get up in one of those trees down there, and he'd say, "Jack, Jack," and poor old Jack would drop everything he was doing and trundle down to Miss Chris's house and say, "Yes, Mrs. Chris, what would you like?" She'd say, "Jack, I didn't call you." He said, "Oh, it's that darn crow." And he hated that crow with a passion. That's my crow story.
They're very clever, aren't they?
Now this one's a little tricky. I don't know about this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. The Blanco school had all grades at that time, and they had no indoor plumbing. They had an outhouse for the boys down east of the school, and one for the girls west of the school. And this cut-up guy that was in my class, Fulcher Johnson, decided he was going to pull a little trick, so he took the inner works of one of the old-style telephones that hung on the wall and had a crank on the side where when you wanted to get your party, you cranked it, and Central downtown would answer and plug him in to whoever he wanted. So he took the crank mechanism out, and it had the magnets on it, and he put on an electrical charge. So he wired, ran a wire from behind the little outhouse inside and tied it to the urinal. And when recess came in the morning, the first, second, and third grades were allowed to go in first, and the other boys waited their turn. I was in the fourth grade at that time, and so I was standing out there waiting my turn, but I had been tipped off that this was going to take place. So about the time the little boys got in the outhouse and started using the urinal, which I believe was a piece of rain guttering, and the wire was tied onto the end of it. He started cranking this crank, and those little old boys came out of the outhouse screaming like banshees. And the school officials did their very best to find who was responsible for that, but I don't think they ever learned it, who did. I certainly never told anybody about it.
You know, the interesting thing about that is if a kid did that this day and age, he'd be a juvenile delinquent and trucked off to some kind of
Well,
facility for naughty kids.
he was in so much trouble all the time that he was periodically banned from school for 2 or 3 days. The summer of that same year, my father hired him to plow for him, and he was using a cultivator, cultivating the land back over on the old Durham place there by the cemetery. And we had 2 mules that pulled the farm equipment. One was named Jack and one was named Tony. And Jack was a good old working, hard-working mule, and Tony was a goof-off. And he had a terrible time the first day he was working, keeping Tony in line and making him do his share of the pulling of the cultivator. So the second day he showed up with his little telephone mechanism, and he mounted it by his seat on the cultivator, and every time Tony would start goofing off, Fulcher would turn the crank, had the wire tied around the mule's tail up where they kept the hair shaved off, and the mule would take off and do his work for a while.
That's what you call motivation.
That was motivation, and that's the only thing I ever saw that motivated that particular mule.
These are great stories, Wyatt.
Well, I hope. Talk a little bit about the courthouse. The courthouse in those days was vacant. All of the county business had been moved to Johnson City. And different things came to use the courthouse from time to time. One of the first that I remember was my Uncle Adley Byers. He put in a little movie, Western, all Westerns, Hoot Gibson and Tom Mix and that crowd. And it was a silent, of course. And some of the old benches were still upstairs, and
So
his screen was...
He showed him up in the courtroom upstairs.
It was in the courtroom upstairs, and it cost us kids, I don't know what they charged the adults, but we paid a nickel or a dime to get in. And during the shows, tape would break, and we had to sit there for a while Uncle Adley repaired it, and then here we'd go again with the stories were all just about the same. They had the villains, and they wore the black hats, and the good guys wore the white hats, so you tell them apart.
Was there a piano player?
Did
someone play the piano? No music?
Vernon played the piano, Vernon Trainer,
Yeah,
my father's brother.
played by ear.
He played the piano quite a bit, and I think maybe he did play there. But the real musician part of it was called the Chautauqua.
Oh, yes.
Now, I don't know how to spell that.
Yes.
I think it's Chitaque or some such thing.
Yeah,
but,
that's one of those wonderful traveling shows. Mm-hmm.
The Chautauqua was a traveling show, and it came from another state.
Mm-hmm.
And they were in different divisions, and 8 or 10 of them would come one week and put on their show. And then the next week another group would come, maybe they'd be musicians or something, and the third week would be singers. And that was the highlight of the year for Blanco entertainment, was when the Chautauqua came to town.
So you weren't one of those boys who didn't have the nickel or the dime and
I
climbed up the
didn't
window?
have, many times I did.
Off.
I didn't have the nickel or the dime.
So I've been told by some of those young boys that grew up at that time that they didn't have the nickel or the dime, so they tried to climb up the wall on the outside of the courthouse and
We
fell off.
We did. No, I didn't do that.
You didn't do that. No.
But I'll tell you how I got a nickel every week. We came when we were out on the farm. I'm sorry, I'm losing my
I
voice.
need a glass of water.
We got out on the farm.
Gary?
And every
There's a
Saturday,
kitchen in the other big room in there.
every Saturday, almost every farmer, about 1 o'clock, they'd start coming into town. And they'd come in wagons, and they'd come in buggies, and they'd come in surreys, and saddleback, and then Model T automobiles, and they all parked over by the courthouse fence, and spent the balance of the day prowling around town. Well, my dad, I had 2 sisters. My dad would give each one of us a nickel apiece. And I would prowl the streets for an hour or 2 before I decided whether I was going to spend my nickel. I'd either go to Charlie Yance's delicatessen and get a triple dip ice cream cone,
Right.
or I'd go to the drugstore and buy a Butterfinger, quarter pounder Butterfinger for a nickel, and a quarter pounder Baby Ruth for a nickel. But anyway, I did have a nickel once in a while, so I had my nickel to go to the movies if I wanted to save it and do that. And that was always on Saturday night, and I don't think any other nights that we had a show. But that was one of
Yeah.
these.
Do you remember some of the events that were held down in the what is the pecan down where the Methodist Church and the Dairy Queen, those circus events or medicine shows?
Well, they had
Great.
they had maybe this will help. They had the medicine shows somewhere down there. The medicine shows would come to town periodically, and they were selling some kind of stuff that they would cure anything. My dad bit one time and bought a big bunch of stuff from one of them to feed to my mother. She wasn't in too good a health, and that was a big waste of money. But anyway, the medicine shows was other entertainment that we had.
And then, of course, with the Glasscocks in town.
And
circus.
we had the revivals down there. All the churches had the revivals down, either in the churches or out in the area. And
Not much of that pecan bottom left, is there?
no, it's just about all gone. There's a lot of activity down there in those days.
Yes.
Now, getting back on the streets of Blanco, on the south side of the street, there was a blacksmith shop. Down on the side of it was on the new highway 281.
Where the Sunset Restaurant is now.
That's true. And after the barber shop, there was a filling station. Then there was the Rock Garage, which was owned by Glenn Greben and Wayne Smith. And I was pretty much fascinated by the blacksmith shop. I would go in there all the time and watch that blacksmith work. Shoed the horses, made steel rims for the wagons.
Do you remember who the blacksmith was?
I tried to think of his name, and I cannot do it to save my life. He was a big man, and he got in trouble. Somebody was breaking into his shop and stealing things, so he set up a trap, put a shotgun in there and tied it down pointing to the door, and if the door was opened, that shotgun would go off. And sure enough, it went off one night and killed this man. And he was indicted and he was tried, and my recollection is that he was exonerated. But that was a little sidelight. But he was a very interesting man, and the way he did all of his work, and he had a big fire going with coal, charcoal, and he would keep it hot by using hand bellows to push the air into these coals, and when they turned orange, then he'd take his tongs and put his metal in there and heat it up, then put it on this giant anvil, take his hammer and hammer it out into whatever shape he wanted. And that was, I thought, a very interesting thing. In the back of his shop was a little area that he used. He put 2 tables back there, card tables, and a bunch of chairs. And the older men in Blanco, I say older, and maybe there were some younger ones, but they'd come there almost every day and play dominoes all day back there in the back of the blacksmith shop. And that was the...
Like they do at the bowling alley now. They meet
No,
at the bowling alley.
no. The bowling alley now is on the opposite side.
Yes, I know, but I said the
Oh,
men
do
come
they
to
have?
the bowling alley
Oh.
early in the morning and play dominoes.
Well, I didn't know that. I don't know anything about Blanco now.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. What was there a store now where Bensal's Red and White used to be?
It wasn't there in the early days of that. There were just those 2 or 3 businesses over there on that side. And I've spent quite a little bit of time in Rock Garage too, because I like to watch them working on cars.
And that was Hoffler.
That was, of course, Glenn Greben and Wayne Smith. And I don't believe they had any helpers. I think they did all the work. And Glenn was also the scoutmaster, and I was a Boy Scout, and he was a great guy.
And later is the postmaster.
Yes, he was a great fellow.
And then Mr. Weber had a store over
Weber and
on the west side.
Wagner and Weber, it was called. And it was over on the west side of the square, where the fire, yes.
Yeah.
Their store was totally burned to the ground.
And then who was on the east side? The east side was the drugstore, of course, and Dr. Fulcher.
Dr. Fulcher, that's another story. Dr. Fulcher was a big man. I would estimate he weighed maybe 300 pounds. And
At least
at least 300 pounds. And in the morning he would get up early and he'd get in his, I think it was a Model A that I remember, and it was a one-seated car. I remember that. And he'd take off and go out in the country and visit all of his patients. He'd get back in town about a little before noon, and instead of going into his office in the drugstore, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
In the drugstore, he would park out by the fence that went around the courthouse.
In the shade.
In the shade. And he would sit there, and his car would sit at about a 60-degree angle like this. Well, when he got out of the car and made it into his office, the car stayed just like that.
Tells you did something to the springs.
It was a funny-looking car when it was sitting out there by itself.
But I remember as a little girl being taken to Dr. Fulcher, sitting in the car in the shade, okay?
Well, that's where he did his Blanco city work.
Yes.
He sat there and wrote
Prescriptions.
prescriptions.
And And you go, then your father or mother would go across the street to the
drugstore and buy and pick up. They had about 10 things that they could prescribe. One I remember was calomel, and one was castor oil. They were big on castor oil, but he did a lot of prescribing and diagnosing there. I broke my wrist once when I was a little bitty guy, about 5 years old, and he said it. He got hold of it and told my dad to hold me, and he pulled, and I screamed, and they said it.
Yes.
And that wrist has been broken 3 times, but that was the first.
Yeah, yeah.
I think maybe I might say something about the fence that they had around the courthouse. That was an interesting fence. The builders, I suppose when they built the courthouse, they also built a fence. And they selected very selective cedar posts, all the same size all the way up. And they would be about 4 feet tall, and they would bore holes into each side of each post up right near the top. Then they would go to the middle of the pole and 2 more holes. Then they'd go toward the bottom about 6 inches off the ground and 2 more holes. Then they would put a joint of 2-inch pipe. What do they call that pipe out there?
Yeah, it's like a railing.
Not aluminum, but it was iron pipe.
Yes.
Anyway, it was rust-proof. They would put a joint of this pipe in those holes, and it would carry it to the next post and continue, and that went all the way around the courthouse. And there were trees there at that time just about all the way around the courthouse. But when the people came to town on Saturdays and they were trying to park, they would drive their team of horses up to that fence and tie them to it all the way around. And the town would be full of people on Saturday afternoon. But that was the fence. Now, getting back to the courthouse for a moment, as to occupancy, we had one dentist in Blanco, and he had his office in the northeast corner room downstairs, and it had a window opening out to the east. And every time he pulled somebody's tooth, he would take that tooth and throw it out the window. And Leroy Elfers and I were kind of fascinated by that, and we'd take a stick and go over there and dig in those teeth. And somebody decided that should be covered up, so once he retired, someone put dirt on it, where it's about 2 inches deep over the teeth. And Leroy and I'd still go over there and take a stick and stir down in there and find those teeth. And I could go to right today and go over there and show you hundreds of teeth in this spot. I know where the teeth are buried.
Now that was before Hempel Edwards?
That was Dr. Edwards.
Hempel Edwards.
Yes, Hempel Edwards. And we had that one dentist for years. And no other.
Yes. And so the newspaper started in the Blanco County News also started
newspaper,
in the courthouse. The bank started in the courthouse.
That's true.
And
that's
there were
true.
Several different
There were a lot of things happening in that courthouse that I don't remember what all there were.
Lots of businesses.
Yes, a lot of them. But that was one of them.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why they put a fence around the courthouse was not only for people to tie their horses to, but everybody had cows,
Oh, yes.
chickens.
Almost every house in Blanco in those days had a barn, chicken coops, and they
A garden.
They had a garden, and even though my parents built this house new and had indoor plumbing, which was unusual for Blanco,
This was
my
the house
dad
on
still
Pecan Street. Mhm.
that's on Pecan Street, and now is occupied by
The coffee
a
shop.
coffee shop. But my dad didn't stop with the house. He built another barn down there, and this is about 1931, and we had a milk cow, we had a flock of chickens, we had some pigs, we had my little paint pony that I rode all over the area with. Go visit Grandpa Will Trainer and stay a week up there. But my mother and dad never objected when I wanted to go to Grandpa Will's. I got on my pony, saddled up, and went.
And that was when he lived up on the Trainer Weiss Road.
Way up that ranch he had for
Right,
years and
right.
years. Yes.
Way up the Trainer Weiss Road. And everyone in Blanco, they had their own milk, their own eggs, because there was not, those things were
They
not
didn't
sold
have-
in the stores.
They really didn't have to buy much, just a
Right.
few staples. They had to buy their coffee and their sugar, and I guess most of the people who lived in town, they didn't have any wheat to grind, but they'd have to buy flour. And the Cage store was the biggest of all of them, and had the most things, and their staples were all in big barrels, and they scooped it out and weighed it, and almost everybody put it on the books. And then when the cotton crop came in the summer, they would sell their cotton and go pay their grocery bill.
Right, right. And they sold things like material for clothes. Women sold a lot of their own clothes. They had needles and thread and all those kinds of things.
Had
like
shoes. They had most of their clothes were work clothes.
Yeah.
I don't remember them having many dress clothes.
No, because the women made their own clothes.
That's true.
But they did sell material for clothes. They did sell yard goods.
During the war, the women made clothes out of flour sacks that were made from cloth for that purpose.
And feed sacks.
Yeah.
And feed sacks. I went to school wearing feed sacks. Yeah. So it was interesting because do you remember the baseball teams in town?
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. You told me that Warren was on that team, and
Warren and Goldwyn and see my Uncle Goldwyn. Now your father's name was Goldwyn, and that's probably
Yes.
why my grandmother named her son Goldwyn.
that
because
could have been.
over and over again they used the same names. And then of course Uncle Carroll, when he he was still in high school, he played on the Blanco. They were the Blanco Indians. I found my father's baseball uniform.
I didn't remember their names, but I went to a lot of their ball games, and they were very interesting. They played ball.
Well, in my own immediate family, my oldest uncle in that family, Arthur, who went to A&M, played on the A&M team. Uncle Carroll played on the A&M team, lettered and played. And then, of course, my father, they said he was the best pitcher of all, and he had to come home from A&M because his father became very ill. You know, he fell and became very ill, and my dad had to come home from college. And but they always said my dad was a very good player, and even in his middle years, when they played, just for the fun of it, he still pitched. So did you remember
I don't
the
remember
teams?
all the players, but they had some good ones.
Oh yes, some very good ones. Yeah.
You mentioned Goldwyn Smith. I all my life I've had a bone to pick with Goldwyn. he was a cousin of mine, of course. And one day I went to the down to see what was going on in the blacksmith shop, and Goldwyn was there standing out, and there was a wagon out front waiting to be serviced. and the frost was real deep on the iron wheel of the wagon. And and said, "Wyatt, see that white stuff on that wheel?" And I said, "Yeah, frost." He said, "Take your tongue and lick it." And he said, "It's pretty good tasting." So the little old kid that I was, and very naive, and I went over there and licked that wheel, and my tongue stuck to that iron wheel, and I couldn't get it loose, and I had to pull some skin off of my tongue, get it out. And as I say, I didn't think that was a fun thing.
No, it was not.
He laughed and laughed, but I wasn't one of the ones that laughed.
One of the things that someone told me several years ago, that when the bigger boys that came in from town, they came in from the country to go to school before the school buses, of course, started running. When I started school in 41, they already had school buses.
Mm-hmm.
But when these kids, like Uncle Goldwyn and my father, Warren, and others that age, because my father graduated in 1923,
Mm-hmm.
and they rode horses then, or the girls came in buggies or whatever, that when the boys left, they had a pen for their horses, and when they would leave school in the afternoon, they would ride like gangbusters through town. Do you remember that? Do you remember that?
Well, I remember most of them coming to school either by horseback or by buggy, or whatever they had, and they tied their horses up down in the trees, and they stayed there all day long, all day, waiting for school to be out and take them back home. Definitely.
Yes. So what else is on your list here?
I bet you wish I'd quit.
No, I think it's very interesting.
Well, this little story has to do with the Boy Scouts and the Rock Garage and things that we've already talked about. But we had a cow that died somewhere in Blanco. I don't remember just exactly where. And so Mr. Greben, our scoutmaster, decided we'd do our good turn. And this was either the 4th of July or Christmas. I'm not sure which. And the reason I remember it was one or the other. Firecrackers were going off all over on this particular day. I think it was a Sunday afternoon. So,
and the point is that firecrackers in Blanco were shot at both the 4th of July and Christmas. Okay?
That's true.
That's why you can't say it was 4th of July, because of firecrackers.
That's true. We were going to haul this to the dump, this old cow that had died, and they used their wrecker for the purpose, and it had a winch on the back. And some of us Boy Scouts got on this wrecker, and Bill Allen and I got in the front seat with Glenn Greben, and the others were hanging on other places, and they had that cow swung up, and we took off very slowly and took it to the dump. And on the way, Bill Allen was sitting in the middle, Mr. Greben under the wheel, of course, and I was no, let me back up on that. I was in the middle, and Bill Allen was on the window side. And Bill opened the glove compartment while we were driving, and there was a big German Luger in there, and he took it out, and Mr. Greben said, "Let me have that thing." And he took it, and he took the clip out of it, and it had a hammer on it, and he aimed it out and hammered it 2 or 3 times. He said, "Now you can look at it." So Bill, as we moved along, he'd shoot out the window at things he thought he ought to shoot at. And click, 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 click. And when we finished with the cow and got rid of her, and we started back to town, unbeknown to me, we were still sitting in the front seat. Bill reached in Mr. Greben's coat pocket and picked up that clip and stuck it back in the gun. And instead of putting the gun in the glove compartment, he dropped it in the seat where we were sitting. And I didn't know all this was taking place. I was looking out over the countryside. We got in front of the garage and parked. Firecrackers were going off around. And Bill got out, and then I happened to look down on the seat, and I saw this gun lying there. I said, "Oh, Bill left this gun lying here in its own cock. The hammer was back." I said, "I'm going to take it off a cock for safety reasons." And the wrecker had no top. It was open, so over the windshield, I pointed that thing up, and there was a Willard battery sign right over the garage door, WILLARD. And the eye had a dot on the top of it, about the size of a silver dollar. I said, "Watch me knock that dot off of that sign." All just talk, you know, to get it off cock. And I pulled it, wham! And that bullet, so help me, went right through the center of that dot as you could ever go. And I was scared to death. I jumped out of that vehicle, and I think I ran. I was so scared. And
I'm sure it scared everyone.
for a long time after that, that stayed up there as a reminder of me. I was pretty safety-minded because I wasn't going to shoot it out here. I was going to shoot it up in the sky. That was that little story.
Yes, yes.
And finally, the rock garage was taken down, and the sign was destroyed, and my memory spot was gone.
Yes.
But when I'd come back to visit my folks after I was long gone from Blanco, that dot still had the hole in it.
What else is on this list? You have a wonderful list here.
Oh, I shouldn't have put so much stuff in here. Most of the other things have to do with how Blanco looked, and how the people lived,
Well,
and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I'll take up some of that. I think I'll start with when electricity came to Blanco. Up until a certain time in the early 1930s, we kids would come home from school in the night, do our lessons, and we had to do it by a kerosene lamp. Didn't have electricity anywhere. And finally, some company decided that they would come in there and build a unit to manufacture electricity and pipe it all over town. And they came and they poured a terrifically thick slab of concrete with big 1-inch bolts sticking up out of it. And then on one end of the building they mounted a diesel engine, and the other end they mounted a generator, and they had a long belt. I think that belt was about 25 or 30 feet long. It was long. And they hired Mr. Ulfers, my next door neighbor, to maintain it and repair it and whatever. He was the one-man show so far as that unit was concerned. Well, for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 weeks before this place was to open up, everybody was busy wiring their house, and it was a simple wiring bit. They would go up in the attic and they'd follow one of the 2x4 timbers up there, or 2x6, and they would nail a insulator here and an insulator here and an insulator there, and run 2 wires about 2 or 3 inches apart along those, and over every room they would put a drop that would go down in the room, and it was a wire that was twisted, had 2 or 3 wires on it, and at the end it had a little snap holder for the bulb, and you just turned the little snap and turned your light on. So that was about it. But that was such a wonderful thing for Blanco people to have electricity. And That operated for a few years before the big boys came in, and we had the what did they call it? The rural electrification.
Yes, was Pernalis Electric.
Pernalis Electric, yes. And things changed.
And that was I can remember, because I was about 6 or 7 years old before PEC was organized. And so I can remember as a little girl coming in and visiting, like Aunt Letha or Aunt Ruth's house and having electricity, and what a big thing that was, and having a radio that you could.
Oh, yeah.
The main thing was, the lights that came on at night.
The lights were on at night. You had a radio you could listen to. It made a different world out of Blanco.
And then it was the refrigerators, and my goodness, it was a whole new world.
Whole new world.
Tell us about the state park, because you were here when the CCC.
Yes, the CCC boys.
Yes.
Well, as a matter of fact, we had one of them roomed with us. For some reason or other, he didn't want to be in the camp. And he and I shared a bedroom in the new house that we had built.
Street. Now, the camp was over in Pittsburgh.
Yes, it was. It was across the river. And
this is about
they had a captain and a second lieutenant, and then the boys. The boys were paid, I think they got $25 a month, but $20 of that went to their parents, their mother, and they got to keep $5 for spending money. And my Aunt Eula had 5 boys, and her husband had taken off, and she had the responsibility of raising and feeding those 5 kids, and she did washing for some of the boys. And my mother felt sorry for her, and she helped her with the ironing. But we were pretty close to that. My dad at that time owned a ice house. The only ice in Blanco was his ice house. And
Pardon?
he had 2 trucks. And one of them would go to New Braunfels and pick up these 300-pound blocks of ice and load his truck and bring it back, put it in the ice house, which was lined with cork. And then people would come there, and we would chop off a piece, whatever they wanted. And the CCC Camp bought 2 300-pound blocks of ice a day from him. That was 600 pounds of ice. So Dad had to go into New Braunfels to get a load of ice one day, and he told me, he said, why don't you get your friend Bill Allen to help you, and you take my other truck, and y'all take that 600 pounds of ice over to the CCC boy. So I said, fine. And so we loaded up. Mid-morning, we loaded up those 2 big blocks of ice and took out and went over, and we drove through the entrance, and we got in there, and this whistle started blowing, toot, 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 toot. And we stopped, and this little second lieutenant came racing up. What are you doing in here? Well, we're bringing your ice. He said, you don't have any permission to get in here. Get out. So I turned, made a U-turn, and took out and went back. We unloaded the ice in the ice house. My dad got back, and he went into the ice house, and he said, what happened to the ice that you were supposed to take? And I told him the story. Oh, it made my dad angry. And he said, well, that's the last ice the CCC Camp is going to get from me. So in a little while, the phone rang, and Dad answered, and the captain said, Mr. Trainer, where's my ice? So he told him what happened. And the first thing he told him, he said, well, you're not going to get any ice. He said, oh, don't say me that. He said, I'd have to send the truck in every day for ice. And so when the story was told, well, he said, I'll take care of that, second lieutenant. Don't you worry about it. So he called him up and he made him apologize to me and Bill Allen for the way he treated us. But he
Yeah.
didn't. That morning he didn't get any ice.
These are wonderful stories, Wyatt. Wonderful stories.